The crown there. On the bill.
In June of 1929, this guy, Charley Patton, a Mississippi Delta singer and guitar player, would take the long train ride, 750 miles from Jackson, Mississippi, all the way to this neighborhood, the small Indiana town of Richmond, and in one day at the Gennett studio would make blues history. Charley Patton arrived here at the beautiful train station in downtown Richmond, and he and a fellow bluesman named Walter Hawkins took the 1-mile trek from here to the Star Piano Factory along the Whitewater River. Now, the Star Piano Company was owned by the Gennett family. They produced pianos, phonographs, and had their own record division and their own label called Gennett Records. And they had a recording studio in the back of the factory along the river, and right in front of it was a railroad spur that often caused the interruption of recording sessions in a very unique setting for blues recording. We are at the site of the Gennett recording studio here in Richmond, right along the Whitewater River. And it is here that Charley Patton arrived in 1929. But by then, this studio had already made music history with landmark recordings by the likes of Louis Armstrong, Bix Beiderbecke, Jelly Roll Morton, and Hoagy Carmichael. But with Charley coming here from the Mississippi Delta, it was time to make blues history. We don't know for sure how old Charley was when he arrived in Richmond. He doesn't have a birth certificate, but we assume he was in his late 30s. From the lone promotional photo taken of him, we know he was a small man of mixed race, possibly part Cherokee, with wavy hair and big ears. He'd never been in a recording studio before, but he played in juke joints and house parties for years in the Mississippi Delta. He was known as a wild showman, and stories abounded about how he played the guitar between his legs and behind his head, and how his gravelly voice could carry hundreds of yards. So when he came to Richmond, he had a whole bag of tricks, and in that sweltering heat on June 14th, he performed a lively mix of original blues, country music, and gospel tunes. I wrote this book on Gennett Records called Jelly Roll, Bix and Hoagy because I've always been fascinated how this record label could set a fire on the blues and jazz movement, often through pure serendipity. And that was the case with Charley Patton. Definitely with Charley Patton. Charley lived for years at the massive Dockery Plantation in the remote Mississippi Delta. By the 1920s, blues music was making commercial inroads with black consumers, and Charley wanted a piece of the action. So he connected with H.C. Spear, a store owner 3 hours away in Jackson. See, Spear moonlighted as a blues talent scout in the evenings for the northern record labels, and he drove all the 3 hours to the Dockery Plantation to listen to Charley, and he loved what he heard. So Spear struck a deal with Paramount Records, owned by the Wisconsin Chair Company in Grafton, Wisconsin, just north of Chicago. Just as Gennett Records pioneered jazz recording, Paramount pioneered black blues. But until now, Paramount had not substantially recorded any music from the distinct Mississippi Delta. But there was one problem. In 1929, Paramount Records stopped recording in Chicago in order to construct a new recording studio in its home base in Wisconsin. So they had nowhere to record Charley Patton. Paramount struck a deal with Fred Gennett to use the Gennett studio in Richmond to record and master 78 discs. This recording ledger shows that Paramount paid Gennett $40 for each track mastered of Charley Patton. Paramount and Gennett worked this arrangement with several blues artists in 1929, including Blind Blake and the very last recordings of the great Blind Lemon Jefferson. The business agreement was simple. The more recordings mastered by the Gennett studio, the more money they made from the Paramount label. So when Charley Patton arrived, the message was simple: give us everything you got. And he sure delivered with some of his best recordings: gospel, blues, folk, some of his landmark records like Screamin' and Hollerin' Blues, Pony Blues, and of course the wonderful Spoonful Blues. Patton was also billed as Paramount's Mask Marvel. It was a bizarre promotion where record buyers had to guess who he was to win a free record. The records from Richmond sold modestly to black consumers in the South, But more importantly, Delta blues music was being documented and disseminated. A movement had begun. With his recording career launched, over the next 4 years, Charley recorded another 44 songs for Paramount at their studio in Wisconsin, and also for the Vocalion label in New York. But almost overnight, the commercial viability of these black blues records came to a crushing halt. The Great Depression crippled the recording industry, with the small labels being hit the hardest. Paramount stopped recording music in 1932, and Gennett's Richmond studio produced its last music in 1934. That same year, Charley Patton died in the Mississippi Delta and was buried in a field near the small town of Holly Ridge in an unmarked grave, a slight later rectified by rocker John Fogerty, who ensured that a beautiful marker was erected. Since his death, the music of Charley Patton has been kept alive by thousands and thousands of musicians across the world, ranging from Bob Dylan to Jack White. But it's always exciting to come to Richmond, Indiana, because even though he spent just one day here in this town, almost a century ago, it is celebrated throughout this city. And why not? Because that one day changed blues music forever.
No use the holly, no use the feeling pride. For you know you got a home, mama, long as I got mine.